Hey everybody, try to get this hook worked out here. Just sending out some invites. All right, let's hope this works. Hey Tia. Thanks for your supporting. Okay. Let's see if he comes back on. Let me see if he's in the guest box. Okay, let's try it again. Let's see if you come. I hope I can hear you this time. Let me make sure my volume's turned all the way up. Yep, my volume's all the way up. My Bluetooth off, so it can't be Bluetooth. And let's bring you up. Hopefully it works this time. Fingers crossed.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we're good now. I thought that would work. I thought that might work. Good deal.
Okay, do you hear me now with the camera?
Yeah, I can hear you. You're just
Oh,
fine.
okay, perfect. Man,
You're
that
good.
was hard.
Yeah, technical difficulties, they tend to happen, but that's okay. It's like a little bump in the road. So how you doing?
I'm doing good, man. I appreciate your rambles on your lives. I myself, I'm scared to do lives. I have a lot of stage fright, so I like to watch you and see how you do it. I think you do it really well.
You're very nice. I tell you, I never have a script. I probably should. It'd be more professional if I had an outline, or I just go and whatever happens, happens. It's kind of I don't know. It's what works best for me, I guess.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm totally okay with that.
Yeah.
So,
So, I mean, we didn't have any questions or any kind of topics set up ahead of time. I mean, it's kind of fun to have organic conversations, like you meet somebody, or like you're talking at the bus stop or the grocery store or whatever, that kind of thing. So, it seems to
mhm.
be. So, okay, so like I said to the audience, I don't know much about your background or anything like that at all. So, how about you know who I am? So, why don't we let the audience hear a little bit about you, whatever you want to share about yourself?
My name is Nathan Rio Garn. I go by my middle name just because I was born in the 80s and there were a lot of Nathans. And I worked at a scout camp when I was a teenager, and there were like four Nathans on staff. So I've been going by Rio ever since. So that's
Hmm.
just my middle name.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I came through Christianity, Christian fundamentalism, deconstructed that. Deconstructed. I was a hardcore conservative. Deconstructed that. I was, I was. I guess I'm going to say I was a laborer within corporate America. Deconstructed that. So, and then you start to once you start to understand that really everything is about economic power. Everything in the end, economic interests are the things that are being represented and protected. It's really easy to understand social issues, and it's really easy to understand Israel. And so, it wasn't hard. I mean, for some of us, the deconstruction, I mean, I think you mentioned that you were raised Christian and you went through some deconstruction. All of that deconstruction makes it a lot easier for us to see what's going on in Israel and to actually call it out.
You know
So,
what? Somebody's saying in the audience they can't hear me, so this be like our worst nightmare when everything keeps not working. Can I get a mic check on me from the audience, please? Can people say if they can hear me or not? Somebody says I'm right, or no, he says you're right. That's about you. Somebody
they
says
can
you
hear
can't.
you.
But for those of you who can't hear me, the best thing to do is to exit the live, exit TikTok, restart TikTok, re-enter the live. That usually works. Okay. Okay, Rio. Sorry. Please keep going on.
No, they can hear you and they can hear me. But
Yeah.
the suppression is so real. Holy cow. I'm not a big creator by any means. I've had my videos on Palestine, videos on should we say the word is not real, should we avoid saying it? What do you think?
Not really sure what the keywords are sometimes. In fact, it's so silly. I can't wait for the day when we can just talk like people. Like,
I
hey,
know,
just
right? I'll just say
um,
Izzy. I'll just say Izzy. Like my
that's
posts
fine.
on Izzy are being like really, really suppressed. And I'm not just saying that as someone who's like, oh my gosh, I'm being suppressed, and when really my content just isn't getting a lot of views. Like my content will go viral and boom, it will be suppressed every time. So they've marked me.
Yep,
They've
yep,
marked me.
same thing, same thing. Yeah, it sucks. I mean, if for those of you who don't know, there's a thing at the bottom of each video you can click on called analytics. It's like more, and then you go through your analytics. And for most TikTok videos, what normally happens is you get your engagement, which is how long people's eyeballs stay before they swipe. It shows you a graph, and it usually goes down pretty quickly. But a lot of the stuff, and then they show you a graph of what the reaches of your video, how many views over how many hours. And so what happens a lot of times is it goes up and it goes straight down, and that's what he's
Exactly.
talking. get a lot of quick engagement. People repost it. The algorithm figures out, hey, this dude, we don't want, and then boom, it just goes to nothing. And that
Hmm.
happens with all of those now. And it's only when people come back in after that and keep that's and it's like whack-a-mole. It goes up, boom, then up, boom. So it's a pain in the ass and miserable.
I had one go viral and then boom, it dropped down, got suppressed. I appealed it. I won the appeal. Boom, then it went viral again. Boom, got suppressed again, but this time they didn't take it down, they just suppressed it and it never went anywhere even though I had already won the appeal. So it's very confusing and frustrating. And I think it's interesting they're doing they just did this recent thing where they're going to start removing content that's Islamophobic and anti-Semitic. They're trying to pretend like they are just
Right.
removing hate speech on both sides, and
Yeah.
they're not at all. And it's just such a farce. They're not removing any pro-Izzy stuff at all. It's purely targeted at pro-Palestine stuff.
Yeah, that's what's happening. And I don't know if you know who Angie Marie is. She's a young, she's a social media manager who's getting pretty big on TikTok. But she's been focused on mostly these issues, like how does the algorithm work? What can we do differently? Hashtags this, all these different variables she's been trying to fiddle with. And so she has a pretty good idea. But I think the algorithm's constantly changing and being retweaked to get around all these things. It's a game of cat and mouse, right? So engagement's important on social media, and it's really unfair that the deck is stacked so badly against Palestinians as it is, and the least we can do is advocate for Palestine, and then they suppress that. It's like, what the hell. So, okay, getting
Yep.
back to your life story, and by the way, thank you for taking the big step into the live camera, because I know it's kind of uncomfortable. For the first week I did this, it felt really weird looking at my phone for 20. It just gets, I'm looking at my face for like an hour at a time. It's not a fun experience, but you get
Yeah.
used. So, your background growing up, what part of the world are you from?
Utah.
Okay.
So I got a full dose of that Mormonism, baby. I got
Yeah.
full Mormonism. Which is it's a really good Mormonism is a really good taste of Christian fundamentalism. It's like growing up evangelical, you know. It's a really really good taste, and deconstructing that for me was very liberating and very healthy. But unfortunately, when you start to deconstruct, you start to see other things that you should deconstruct. And so then you deconstruct the conservatism as well. And then you deconstruct the economic interests, like I was talking about.
Yeah.
And then when the United States starts to meddle in things, it's a lot easier to see once you're deconstructed. And the video, you watched a video the other day where I talked about the importance of deconstructing capitalism and internalized capitalism. And I just think all of that, once you deconstruct those things, um, Israel, the whole conflict in the Middle East really does become so simple. And in the end, we have to remember, like the conflict is simple. It is simple. It's imperialism. It's occupation. That's what it is.
Yeah, those are really good points. And again, you're talking about capitalism, and even if it's a different ism, the hierarchy and power structures that come to play in different societies are remarkably similar. The economic system is not necessarily indicative of the authoritarianism or the power structure, but it seems like capitalism, with its militarism and its exploitation of labor and resources and ecological destruction, is like the worst of the worst on steroids of the connection between the worst ism and the worst authoritarian control systems that there are. So, how do you feel about that?
No, I just totally agree. And this comes back to talking about capitalism relates directly to the conflict in the Middle East, because why is America even interested in Israel at all? Why do they want to have influence in the Middle East to begin with? Why is it that we need
Hydrocarbons.
exactly? Why is it that we need a proxy nation, a place to like basically Israel's kind of like a weapons storage shed for us in the Middle East. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's like, and I think that a lot of Americans, especially, are like, why do we need this alliance? Why is it? So we could, I mean, what do you think about that? Why do you think Biden and America is holding so desperately onto this alliance, even while it's making them look bad? What do you think their interests?
Well, it's obvious that there's two basic. I did a video about this. They got like 3.5 million views when I first started doing this. I was like, damn. But it was on this exact subject. Why does the U.S. need Israel? Like, what's really going on? And you hit the nail on the head again. You have really good insights to all this stuff, which is cool. It's a landing base. Remember World War II? Because when we tried to get into France at Normandy, remember how hard it was. Look how many men and equipment we lost trying to break through the defenses just to have a landing base. You have to have logistics to fight wars. And having a beachhead that you can just bring your stuff in through the Mediterranean on ships is incredibly valuable in terms of being able to fight a potential conflict. Look at Afghanistan. It's landlocked, it's hilly, and everything has to come in by air or very slowly by vehicle, which are very dangerous routes that can be ambushed. So
Mhm.
logistically, Afghanistan is a nightmare, and it's so much more. Everything costs like 1,000 times more to get it from where you want to start from, where you've got to get it to be able to do the fighting. So, in that regard, it's strategic just for that reason alone. Also, they're a very heavily armed country with the largest military in the region. They kind of act as a cop to kind of keep the kids down, so to speak, so they don't get out of control in the region. And then, of course, if there is going to be a conflict, it's immeasurably important as far as U.S. strategic needs. It's in the center point of probably the most strategic and easily accessible light crude sweet oil in the world. Which, if you don't know the difference between the different types of oil, that when you take oil, there's different grades of it. Some are heavier and more sort of clogged up with junk, and others are really lean and sweet, like motor oil would come out of the ground. And the Saudis have the largest oil field in the world called Ghawar, which is in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, and it has immense amounts of the lightest, sweetest crude in the world. It's the easiest to refine. It's the most valuable oil, and that it doesn't require a lot of costly distillation to take place. So it's incredibly important, and that's why the U.S. has this sort of deal with the devil with Saudi Arabia, because you know
Mhm.
what they have now. What changed that, and what's kind of chilled relations, is that the U.S. If you don't know this, the U.S. about maybe 12 years ago came up with a technology called hydraulic fracturing, maybe a little bit longer, I don't know exactly, but that allowed the US to go into previously undevelopable formations of oil called shale and natural gas. And they use a horizontal technique with pressure, sand, water, and chemicals to go drill horizontally and break up these pockets that are sort of small pools of oil or gas, and it creates larger pools that they can then suck out of the ground. Now, it's terrible for the environment, but it totally changed the energy dynamics such that the US became a net oil exporter instead of a net oil importer, which
Mm.
is a huge change, obviously. So we didn't need them as much. We still need them long term, right? But we're consuming all of our own oil for our own needs, our own natural gas. We only consume 20% or maybe a little less of all the natural gas that this process now produces. So think about that. 80% of what these people are capable of producing, they can't sell it domestically. So that changed everything. It's like in the short term, the discovery to be able to exploit shale oil. So that's all these dynamics have changed slightly, but you're seeing these amazing tugs and pulls between the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. It's like this big tug of war that's going on right now. It's fascinating how it's playing out. So,
You know
it's all
what?
about resources and it's always about power, right? Those are the two big things.
Okay, exactly. So now, the last two wars, so we have the invasion of Ukraine, that happened on social media, right? It was like there was really never a war like the invasion of Ukraine because it was happening totally real time, totally on social media. And then this latest one with the conflict in Palestine, totally on social media. And with the Ukraine war, we see how weird and perverted and stupid Putin was, right? He's romanticizing this empire that existed before him that he feels responsible to. He wants to resurrect the Soviet Union, right? He's romanticizing it, and everyone thinks it's so stupid that he's only interested in economics, that he's only interested in maintaining power. But when we do it, it's harder for the West to see that we are literally doing protecting the same. In the end, it's about our economic power. It's about our military might. It's about maintaining our economic interests. And something that you said that was so powerful, and I'll always bring this up. You said at a geopolitical international level, when people are making decisions, morality does not even factor in. And so that's what we're all seeing. We're seeing that because the US wants to protect its economic interests, which is ultimately its power structure, that's how it holds on to power, is by protecting its economic interests. It's so interested in doing that that it will literally commit genocide and it will aid and it will do apologetics for genocide. It will defend it and fund it, and people are completely disgusted. And I guess there's kind of like a global awakening right now, and we're like, well, we don't want to operate this way. We don't want to do things only to protect economic interests. Genocide is just, it's unacceptable for any reason at all. And so there's this, World War, it's perfect that you brought up World War II, because all of this, what Russia is doing and what the United States is doing, allowing genocide, it's all kind of old. It feels old to me, protecting these global interests and still playing like World War II games. That's kind of how I feel. Do you kind of resonate with that?
Well, I did want to share an alternative viewpoint for
Yeah.
what is going ahead of the Russian head of state, because I didn't really understand much about this. Like most people, like just with this issue, from our media, we get a very slanted perspective. They send us what they want us to hear, and so it manufactures consent behind certain things. That, having an educated, well-rounded, critical thinking public is the last thing that the governing apparatus wants, because that means people start to question everything. So this is another way to see what's happening in Ukraine that fits better into the very paradigm that we've been talking about. So in terms of why people do stuff, we know that why the H group did what they did. It was a part of a long-term resistance struggle against oppression, right? That makes sense. Now you can paint it as an unprovoked attack, right? So same logic. Was it an unprovoked attack by the Russians, right? Now we know it wasn't unprovoked by the H group. We were told it was, at least that's what they tell our public. So do you think it's possible that what Russia did in Ukraine might not have been unprovoked the way we were told? So just think of that for a second. Give that some. Now, it's a long and convoluted story going back to what happened, even back in 1990 when there's the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So it's a longer story. I don't want to tell all of it, but fast forward, there was a big change of government, an illegal transition of power in 2014. There was a protest against the sitting president, Viktor Yanukovych, in 2013 leading into 2014. There was an area called the Maidan Square where people were gathering for weeks and weeks and weeks and it was a growing protest. They were trying to get the government to more move towards the European Union. Viktor Yanukovych was more sympathetic to working with the Russians in terms of economic development. Yanukovych had been presented with a big deal for the EU, and he was ready to sign it with the IMF, the World Bank, the whole nine. So all these Western capitalists were like, yeah, they knew they were going to get their hooks into Ukraine. The last minute, Yanukovych got an offer from the Russians, which was a better deal, and he took it. That really enraged the West. They're like, God, because it's all about the oligarchy. Let's be straight, right? And making money. So there's other geostrategic reasons as well. If you study Professor John Mearsheimer, he'll talk about the big power politics and what the U.S. state wanted in conjunction with the oligarchs, which is they tend to go hand in hand. So bottom line is NATO had increased its presence with 15 former Soviet republics joining NATO, or some of the, and now we've had Finland join, and Sweden's talking about joining right now. But the U.S. promised the Soviets, Mikhail Gorbachev, when he was in power, that they wouldn't expand 1 inch to the east if the U.S. would allow what was East Germany to reintegrate and become one Germany with West Germany, and they would be able to bring them into NATO, because of course it was a Soviet controlled part of Germany on the what's called the Iron Curtain, the eastern part of what was Europe at that point. So, and then all of those states that were part of, most of them that were part of that block, that Iron Curtain, have since been incorporated into NATO, moving ever closer to Russia's western border.
Yeah.
And Putin basically gave a speech in 2007 in Germany saying, listen, I got to draw a red line at Ukraine. I got to draw a red line at the state of Georgia, both of which border the western and the southwestern portion of Russia, respectively. Wish we had a map I could show you. So he drew a red line and said, listen, that has to stay a neutral state. It has to remain a buffer. We can't have it be in NATO control. We don't want NATO weapons, NATO missiles, NATO armaments. The U.S. basically ignored that. And they sort of dangled the idea of coming into NATO for the Ukrainian leadership, but they were arming the Ukrainian military in a de facto way. Most people don't know this, but when you join NATO, you have to buy all of the compatible arms and equipment that works interoperably with the NATO fighting machine. So every time the arms manufacturers, they get a huge, bonus. It's like Christmas morning for those people, because you join NATO, now you got to spend billions of dollars that the country has to cough out, that goes to the weapons manufacturers. Most people don't know this. I didn't. So what is all this building up towards? So you have a combination of the encroachment of US NATO towards Russia, this machine that's kind of just growing with inertia. And he's put out this sort of red line saying, hey, dude, I've told you over and over again. There's a whole other issue with what was happening in Ukraine with Viktor Yanukovych. I mentioned the coup in 2014. Yanukovych got deposed. So he was forcibly removed from office. There was an event that took place. There was a shooting that took place during that protest I mentioned, where a bunch of police officers and a bunch of civilians got shot and unalived. And everyone thought it had been done, or it was put out publicly, that Yanukovych government was suppressing the peaceful protesters. So it was blamed on the president, but it was really done by some rogue elements of the western portion of Ukraine, these Ukrainian nationalists that are Azov Battalion, the Right Sector, Adar Battalion, these hardcore neo,
Hmm.
schmazis
Yeah.
that are indeed in Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe. They have a strong presence and they have a very inordinate control of the power structure in Ukraine. They're not big numbers. They only control like 1 or 2% of the elected body, but they have a huge influence within the military and throughout the western portion of Ukraine. I didn't know this either, but in the eastern part of Ukraine, that borders Russia, a lot of people, this was all part of the Russian Empire way back when. You got to remember that it was only during the Soviet Union where they carved out these like republics. And Ukraine got its independence in 1990 when the Soviet Union fell, but they still had a lot of people that were sort of Russian speakers and ethnically Russian in the eastern part of Ukraine. We were told that it was all just Ukrainians, right? It's Ukraine, they're Ukraine. No, there's a huge divide politically and culturally and socially, language, culture, historical identification, family lineage. Basically all the people in the East are Russian speakers. And when Yanukovych got deposed, they were the ones who had voted in a very small majority for Yanukovych to win. So they were pissed off, right? If you're a Democrat and you voted in Biden and tomorrow morning Trump took over, you'd be like, what the F? Like, that's not fair. Well, you voted the guy in and now you're just getting rid of him, right? That people would be outraged. Same thing. So there was started to be very a tension between the people in the west of Ukraine who supported the coup that took place. And by the way, the U.S. backed this, and they were
Yeah.
totally in control of it. There was fighting going on between the people in the east, which are the Russian speakers, and the people in the west, who are they hate Russians. These really powerful sort of neo schmazis. They hate Russians like you wouldn't believe. It's like more hatred than anything we're seeing in this conflict. It's off the chain. So they started shelling, just like we're seeing with what Israel's doing. They started doing the same type of thing. They started bombing and unaliving civilians at just like randomly just blowing up buildings or just lobbing artillery into anywhere it would fall, just indiscriminately sending in. And 15,000 people from 2012 or 2014 when that coup happened until 2021 when this whole started to bubble got unalived in that region.
Was it
Just
mostly Crimea? Was
no,
it
no, no.
mostly?
Well, I'll tell you. So I fast forwarded past Crimea. So there's a naval base in the southwestern tip of Crimea, which is part of Ukrainian territory, officially sovereign territory. That's like Guantanamo Bay, because it's the only warm water point that the Soviets maintained during the Soviet Union that they had access to. So that's called Sevastopol. And so, just like any other area, when you have a lot of troops from an area, you have a lot of people that get married and have families. And so, the majority of the population, the vast majority, is Russian speaking. And similarly to those in the East, same kind of population demographic. So, it's Ukrainian territory with a little naval base like Guantanamo Bay that's owned by the Russians, but it's in Ukraine. And there's always been a tension because, again, those people in the western part of Ukraine don't like Russians. So the people in the mainland of Crimea and the people in the western part of Ukraine have always had like a historic grudge. Like what that why it's like imagine in Germany when I was there. I was there as a US soldier when I was in the military. The younger people in Germany didn't want us there. They didn't like us. When I would go out with friends to a bar when I was 23 or 22, they looked
Hmm.
at it, they gave that look like what the hell are you idiots doing here? Same type of dynamic. Okay, they were looked at as like encroachers or invaders or interlopers is the best word to use. So what happened was when
Hold
this
on,
whole
pause 1 sec. Pause 1 second.
yeah yeah
Weren't before that, before it was mostly Russian families, like you say, wasn't the general populace, like large amounts of the populace of Crimea, actually deported somewhere? Or correct me if I'm wrong on that. Am
I
I
don't
wrong?
know if that's the case. I don't believe that's the case. I've never
Okay,
heard that part of the story, but if
okay,
it's
okay,
there, hear about it. So it's possible. I mean, I don't know every detail about all these things,
okay,
just
okay.
the basic flavor. I've listened to people like Scott Ritter, Colonel Douglas McGregor, Jackson Hinkle, and others to try to figure this stuff out. So,
Yeah,
and by the way, this is not something that I knew a lot about until the conflict. Like
yeah.
unlike Israel-Palestine, I kind of had to catch up. But,
Mhm.
the more I learned, the more I was like, damn, it's like any other thing. The more you learn the real deal, you're like, this is messed up. I only knew part of it. So
Mhm.
immediately after the change of power, the illegal transition of power, the coup d'etat that took place in the Maidan Square, where Yanukovych had to flee to Belarus, which is just north of Ukraine. Basically, what happened was the people in Crimea were like, NFW, no way. We don't want to be a part of this. We want to join the Russian Federation. So they held a referendum. It passed like 98-2, which is how popular the Russian system is there versus Ukraine because of that tension that's been there. And so Russia agreed to annex the remainder of Ukraine in 2014, which the US said was a takeover, like an invasion and takeover.
Okay.
It was like
Yeah.
an illegal takeover. But the people there voted for it before it happened. Now, some people claim it was a sham referendum who are voting from the US and Western Ukrainian side. But I believe that it was a legitimate, referendum that took place, and then the Russians moved troops in to protect that new structure from being violently, for a violent repression from the central government and those thugs in Ukraine. So that's what happened. That's what took place in 2014. Now, fast forward to 2022, all these tensions had built up. Between 2017 and 2019, there was two efforts to have a peaceful settlement and resolution for this back and forth that was taking place, mostly coming from the Ukrainian side into the eastern part called the Donbass, and then of course the south, which is called Mariupol. So in those regions, the people were just getting basically slaughtered. Let's face it, that's what was happening. And they couldn't do much to retaliate because they weren't heavily militarized. They had small arms, but that was about it. The Russians did provide some of that, but the Russians didn't want to get too involved. They were begging Putin for years, hey, come in and help us. We're like you. We're like Russians. He wouldn't do it because he didn't want to deal with all the consternation, just like the Arab nations are coming in now to help the Palestinians. Same idea, right? There's just
Mhm.
too many other considerations and problems it would bring them because it would just open a hornet's nest, right? All the problems with their finances. So anyway, so you have to make a really tough decision sometimes. The the benefits have to outweigh the drawbacks for anybody to make a decision politically. So that's why things had to wait. But there were two different efforts up in Minsk, Belarus, where the French, the Germans, and the Russians got together to try to create a detente, a set of rules that would stop the bombings and would create some sort of semi-autonomy for these Russian people in the East who weren't happy with the fact that the central government had been flipped on them. Okay, the central government of Ukraine started to pass laws that outlawed the use of Russia in all government documents, in all schools, basically trying to take away their ability to be themselves, like stripping them of their, imagine if Arabic was taken away from the West Bank. Couldn't be,
Identity. Yeah. Yeah.
right? So it's that kind of stuff. A little different, but similar to the same. So with all these tensions, they tried to work out what's called the Minsk One Accords. And they came up with a settlement that they were going to try to abide by. And every time they came up with something, the Ukraine government, spurred on by the US, broke the agreement and were still aggressed on the people in the East. So they tried it again a couple years later, same kind of idea. The rogue nature of the Ukrainian military. This is hard to understand because in the US, we have very centralized command and control. So if you're a rogue element in the US military, you'd be put down right away, like if you don't follow the rules or the orders. But that's not the case in Ukraine. These hardliner right wing, what are called banderites, they're ultra nationalist Ukrainians that sort of hate Russians and they blow off the central government. They're like, listen, if you don't get off our backs, we're going to take your family and send them on a long trip off a short pier, right? So Zelensky was trying to get these guys to slow their roll because he was trying to keep Minsk and keep the peace, based on what they want, based on what they're trying to do to avoid the carnage, because they thought the Russians might do something if they didn't stop doing it, and that doesn't help Ukraine, right? So, but they kept blowing him off, like "F you, we hate these people, you can go to hell." So that
Mhm.
was going on, and the U.S. is kind of like laughing all the way because these crazy people that are ultra nationalists are doing their dirty work, trying to pull Russia into a war, but that wouldn't benefit Ukraine because they're going to lose hundreds of thousands of people, which we've now seen happen.
Yeah.
So this is all the jockeying that was going on. Putin knew
Mhm.
this. Ukraine is moving over. The U.S. is playing this game like both sides of the issue. Telling people in Minsk, Belarus one thing, but then secretly arming them and pushing it on the other. They knew what
Mhm.
was going on. The State Department. This is what they do. They
Yeah.
play games to antagonize people and just create unrest to destabilize things to try to get their hooks into places both geostrategically and economically. That's how it works.
That's how it
So
works.
finally, after the Ukrainians violated Minsk one and Minsk two, Putin realized that that there was no negotiation, just like the Palestinians have realized there's no negotiations with the Israel. They want a path to peace, but it never works itself out. Well, Putin realized there's no path to peace. There's no peaceful resolution to this. I'm either going to have to go in, or the Ukrainian military is going to come in and slaughter these people and just take over the territory. In fact, the Ukrainian military was massing 160,000 troops on their way over to do just that when this whole thing kicked off in
What
February.
year? What year are you in right now? Is this 20?
This is January of 2022.
Okay.
Right before things kicked off in February. So Putin weighed all these variables. He looked at the U.S. as a bad actor, not going to negotiate, still arming them, trying to put missiles in, which would reach Moscow in like 7 minutes from where it is in Ukraine, and decided, you know what, F it. We got to go in. Now, what they tried to do is they tried to go in and immediately disrupt the Ukrainian government, thinking that if they had command and control at the central level, that would allow them to quickly and easily overcome having to fight a protracted battle. That didn't work. They were
hmm
rebuffed by the Ukrainian military, which, by the way, is a very good military backed by U.S. armaments. So it's a good military. It's not. They're not cupcakes. They're not powder puffs. So they resisted that part, which came from the north, from Belarus. But in the east and in the southeast, and from the Sea of Azov, which is the naval base around Sevastopol and Crimea, just to the east of that, they came into the ground. They had a lot more success. And slowly but surely, the Russians had superiority in terms of air superiority, because the Ukrainians don't have the F-15s. We've heard about that. And with artillery, this has been an artillery war, just trench warfare, boom, boom. And the Russians have been able to outlast and get drones from Iran, which has been the supplemental weaponry that's made the biggest difference in this fight. And they've been able to they've been moved into the territory and have, quote unquote, liberated the people in the east from bombardment. They've moved the Ukrainians back far enough that their short range weapons don't work the way they used to. But the longer range weapons, the HIMARS system, which are those multi-rocket systems, they have different ranges. And the U.S. kept sending longer and longer range weapons such that
hmm
they could reach Russia. And so that's where the whole thing about it broadening into a bigger war and escalating. They weren't going to give F-15s, now they are, at least from their proxies. Different nations like Poland, they weren't going to give the HIMARS, then they did. So the U.S. is playing this escalation game, trying to draw Russia further in. Putin didn't want to do this at all. He has no design on growing his empire. He only
Mm.
wants to protect the Russians in the east and destabilize the military and the Yahtzees that are in the military to try to reduce their power, to create sort of a neutral buffer state and not have this thing escalate into a broader conflict. That's their goal. So what they've done is they've moved in to secure the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass, which is Donetsk, Luhansk in the east,
Yeah.
Mariupol south, and they're figuring out what to do next based on how this plays out. They may move further west to take over Odessa and maybe even move into that area in Romania over there on the other side of the border. But that's
So
still
you
being
don't.
figured out.
Sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
No,
Go ahead.
please interject, please. I'm
So,
talking like,
so you don't think that Putin was romanticizing the Soviet Union and at least trying to bring back some of it,
no,
just this glorious?
that's a ruse being talked about to try to create anger among the American public that he's a brutal dictator, a murderer. He's trying to take over the world. He's going to be in East Germany soon if we don't stop him. That's all the bullshit story, like WMD.
Well, that's what the UN, like the UN was saying those things. When African leaders talked to Putin, they were like, "Listen, don't romanticize the past." So this is a good perspective. This is a good perspective you're giving, huh?
Yeah. So think about what are the interests of the Russians? You got to remember, everyone does things for their own interests, right?
hmm
So yes, would it be morally the right thing to do to move in and help those Russian people? Yeah, but he waited like 7 or 8 years to do this, right? He knew about it long before. Well, the reason why he had to act was the U.S. was not going to stop what it was doing. It was going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And he just realized these people aren't going to keep their word. So I'm either going to sit back and let them push up to my border and put missiles in, or I can go in and push it back a little bit and take charge of the situation and thin out the Ukrainian military. What Putin said when he announced the special military operation, which is what they called it, he said there's two goals of the operation. One was to demilitarize, in other words, weaken the Ukrainian military and take away the ability of them to be a functioning force to take over the territory and move into the east, as well as de-Schmatzify, de-Yatzify, meaning
hmm
thin out the ranks of these really powerful ultra nationalists who are basically driving all the worst elements of what was happening. So they accomplished that. They've offed 500,000 plus Ukrainians, many of whom on the front line initially were these Yahtzees who wanted nothing more than to go out and take on an unalive Russians, which they have done a lot of, by the way. But over time, the people that were in that base down in Mariupol, I forget the name of the train. I don't remember the name of it. It was a big underground steel plant.
Okay.
The name escapes me, but they were under there for like a month, and they finally came out because they ran out of supplies. It's like the tunnels right now we're seeing. So they came out and they had these soldiers undress, like just to make sure they weren't weaponized. And these guys had tattoos of Stepan Bandera, who's this
Yeah.
collaborator during World War II that basically unalived about 60,000 people. You know, a lot of different. I'm not going to mention, but you can figure it out.
Yeah.
And they have tattoos of the Mustache Man, or they have
Yeah.
insignia like
All of
SS.
it. All
All
of it.
these tattoos indicating that they're basically the neo Yazis, right? And so
Yeah.
the U.S. had said this was the party line in the Western media. How could Ukraine have neo Yazis? Zelensky is a Jewish president, but they don't. People on the outside think, like I told you about the central government versus the Yahoos. In the U.S., there's command and control, which would make sense to us, but those dynamics aren't the same in the country of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Not to mention, we didn't talk about this. Ukraine has traditionally been one of the most corrupt places on earth, where
Yeah.
Western business interests launder all sorts of money. It's a total disaster. You have Hunter Biden, who is
Yeah.
sitting on the board of a gas company called Burisma. And
Yeah.
Burisma was under investigation by the Ukrainian central, I guess you'd call it just like we have the attorney general, right? The
Yeah.
chief prosecutor in there was like the attorney general investigating, corruption and payoffs and bribes by Burisma to get different contracts. Hunter Biden sat on the board of this company, getting paid like $1 million+ a year to be a pawn that had access to the president of the U.S. Why did they want that? It's like a get out of jail free card. Biden went over and threatened to withhold U.S. aid to Ukraine, $1 billion or more, that he wouldn't release unless they got rid of and fired this prosecutor that
Yeah.
was putting the heat on Burisma. They did it because he threatened it, and they got their aid. They got rid of the prosecutor and put somebody in, as Biden said, who was solid, meaning he wasn't going to pursue the charges against Burisma. And there you go. So this is all the cronyism, the bribery, the bullshit, and it's all about economics, power, and control. It always goes back to that. So none of this stuff has been made public to the American public. You just have to look for it. You got to dig. And so that's what I do. I dig and I dig and I dig, and this is the stuff that comes up, and it's not pretty, right? And I don't mean to talk the whole time. I want to give you a chance. So
No, no,
how do
no.
you feel? How do you feel hearing all that, Rio, versus what you said initially? How does that
Well,
make
no,
sense?
like, well, it doesn't change the overarching narrative that this is all about economic power structures. Okay.
Yeah.
And regardless, I mean, I know that there's a couple different narratives when it comes to that guy that Biden wanted. What's the guy that you just mentioned that Biden wanted to remove because they were saying uh, people say that Biden wanted to get rid of him because he was investigating his son, but then there's another
Not his,
narrative that
no,
says,
no, no, not his son. The company and its different business dealings that were corrupt, and the owners of the company put Hunter Biden on their board for the purpose of having access to Biden. That if things got sticky, he'd be able to come in and basically take care of them and not let things blow up. And there's also accusations that some of the money that was flowing through outside of Hunter's initial salary that was made public, that
Mhm.
was the gravy and behind the scenes money, 10% of which went to the big guy, meaning Joe
Okay,
Biden.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
Biden was directly proud. By the way, Joe Biden was a senator for the longest term of anybody in the history of the country. He has like a $38 million set of properties, and he's only made about maybe $12 million in all of his life from his work. So how do you have $38 million of property? Just does it just magically appear? And this is where you
Standard.
start to figure out, this
That's
is how this
just
stuff
standard.
happens.
That's run of the mill U.S.
Yeah,
politics, unfortunately.
no doubt, no doubt.
And I think that the biggest change in narrative, and it's interesting, all of your opinions and everything that you said about Ukraine is very interesting. The thing that we're seeing right now with these last two wars, with Ukraine and then Israel, or sorry, the Palestine conflict, what we're seeing is that this this image of Western righteousness is essentially gone. Like NATO, people were genuinely convinced like NATO was and anything representing Western interest was just inherently righteous, even though it's just as authoritarian as anything else. So I think that the main point in all of this is that we are seeing, this is my belief, we are seeing a rise of a new narrative. And it's not just in one country that this is happening. This is a global narrative. I mean, you have people in China, Japan, South America, Africa, seeing now that colonialism is still alive.
Hmm.
We're seeing now that morality, like you said, I'm always going to point this out, morality is not even factoring in to geopolitics and to the decisions of the most powerful actors on the earth. So the idea that there's this righteous democracy that's giving everyone freedom, and that's really what we're doing, man. We're just spreading freedom and we're just spreading love and honesty. That's gone. And the new narrative that everyone, including us in the US, are seeing is that it's all about rich people protecting economic interests. That's what it is. That's the new
Yeah.
narrative.
And by the way, just so you all know, that this game that we're looking into and is becoming more aware to people has been around forever.
Yeah.
It's just people are waking up to it because it's being thrust into their face. They're seeing the inability of the population to make changes vis-a-vis what they want to have done. It's just kind of making them realize, like, oh my God, this is a kind of a locked system. And so they just go down the line and be like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? There's a great author by the name of Michael Parenti. It's Parenti. If you haven't read Michael Parenti's, I've read all his books. This is the guy to look. He's done a lot of investigation into the covert actions that the U.S. has been taking and overt for the last 100 years, and what it does in terms of messing with other countries, trying to spur on the stuff we saw in Ukraine. It's all the same basic approach. It starts with destabilizing countries through the use of non-governmental organizations. Well, just read his book. You'll read his book. I'm just repeating stuff that he said.
Yeah. I was a Mormon missionary in Mexico. I was a
Yeah,
Mormon.
the most important thing to think of is
Oh,
just
sorry.
in terms of understanding. It's okay. In terms of understanding the dynamics here, if China wanted to establish either in southern Canada or northern Mexico a military alliance and arm and weaponize them so they could put missiles that would be 5 minutes from DC, would
Mhm.
the U.S. stand for that? And the answer is hell no,
Yeah,
right?
of
We don't
course not.
like Cuba. Cuba hasn't broken out of a naval blockade since 1962. That's still in place. So the
Mhm.
U.S. is so concerned in punishing the Cuban, leadership that they still maintain a naval blockade and control what goes in and out of Cuba. That's unbelievable, right? So that's in our hemisphere. We have this thing called the Monroe Doctrine. People can't set up shop in our hemisphere that are contrary to our desires. No adversarial presence. So therefore, why should the Russians, who are a big power player in that region, they have nuclear weapons, they have tons of resources, they have strong leadership, and even though they took a big blow when the centralized autonomy during 1980s and 90s fell down, like broke apart, which is a huge blow to Russia and their strength, but they've rebuilt slowly. And there's a whole other story about Russia I want to share at some point because it fits into this narrative and why Putin has been so able to take charge of the country and has been able to stay in power. But
Mhm.
notwithstanding that, basically, Russia has to protect their interests too, right? It would be irresponsible for a leader of a country, for example, the U.S. president, to allow the Chinese to set up a military base in Montreal and with a bunch of weapons, right? We'd be like, dude, that's crazy. Or
Unthinkable.
in Mexico, yeah. So it would be basically a dereliction of duty for a president of a country who isn't protecting their interests long term by protecting them from potential military harm and encroachment by a foreign adversary. That's why he did it, not because he had some power hungry vision and woke up one day and said, how can I take things over? That's not how it works. Now, under the Germans, they had a very offensive mind of capturing territory, but that's not Putin. If you study him, he's basically a pretty moderate conservative Christian who's a staunch Russian nationalist. And he gets portrayed as this evil monster, which again is just like the same old story. Maduro down in Venezuela,
Yeah.
he's
I was just going to say Maduro. I was just going to
it's
bring
all
up
the
Maduro.
same. It's all the same story. If you hear somebody being vilified over and over in the media, it's almost never true. And the reason why they're being vilified is not because they're a bad guy. It's because they're using their resources to try to help their population and not letting the foreign corporations come in and take their cut or most of it, if not all of it. That's always the case. So just like in Russia, that's what's driving all of this too at the really long-term level. U.S. strategic interests and people that are making money in Russia were basically told to go packing. Same thing that happened in the Euromaidan. I talked about the fact that what's his name, Yanukovych, didn't want to take the European deal, the Western business interests. Well, Putin basically wouldn't allow the oligarchy, who had been, raping the country under the Yeltsin years, when everything went from private ownership, from state ownership to private ownership. A lot of U.S. and British interests came in and basically robbed the place and just took over and basically marginalized the workers like capitalism does. Getting back to what Rio was saying,
Yeah.
and, it's always the same game. So Putin comes in and is like, what the hell? The standard of living among the average, worker in Russia went from being pretty good with a pension, not great, but decent, dropped by 60%. And people are struggling and having a hard time and leaning on the government for more and more help, saying, hey, we're being squeezed here. And so that's what had to change. And that's what did change, which is another reason why Putin is hated by the West. First 2 years, you can find news clippings from him saying he's a great guy, didn't change anything. But he started to put the hammer down on the BS from the outside capitalists. And that's when everything changed. Plus, he did not go along with the 2003 coalition of the willing, because Putin came into power at 2000. You can find archived news clippings in the New York Times from the business community, like, these leaders on Wall Street saying how great the guy was, that he's allowing, great
Hmm.
investment in the country and all this, the same old shit. They call it foreign investment, right?
Hmm.
But it's
Hmm.
really just foreign takeover resources. You have a leader who plays ball who gets paid off. That's kind of thing.
Yeah.
And he would take the money. He wouldn't play ball. And that's why he's hated. Anyway,
Wouldn't you call Putin a dictator at least, or a de facto dictator?
I would call him a strong man, but you'd be shocked at how many people in the country support him.
Yeah.
Mainly because it's like anything else. Listen, if gas prices go down, your standard of living goes up over the course of 8 to 10 years. You're happy. Now, you may have aspects of your leader you don't like because he maybe suppresses free speech. He
Mhm.
suppresses other people who try to challenge his power in
Yeah.
ways that they probably aren't happy with, but their lives are better. Just
I
like China.
see.
People in China accept the authoritarian government because their lifestyle is improving.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Same idea.
I see Putin as an authoritarian. I see Russia as an oligarchy. I see the United States as an oligarchy. Putin is a billionaire.
Russia is not an oligarchy.
You don't think so?
No, that's the same old story too. That he's in cahoots with all these
Okay,
the
okay.
oligarchs that he could have gotten money from and taken money from. He kicked out of the country because they were basically stealing from the working class and completely screwing them. So that can destabilize a country, by the way, as we're
Of
seeing in
course.
America
Yeah,
now. As people get more marginalized, what do? Do they take it, or do they get angry and they want to rise up? That's one of the reasons why the U.S. supported that being done. It's always the same playbook. Look what happened in Syria. The U.S. is trying to destabilize Syria to get Assad out and to get somebody more Western friendly in. Same thing with Iran. It's always the same thing. They had the Shah, which took over from Mossadegh, who was going to
yeah.
nationalize the oil in Iran. So they got rid of him and put in this Shah, Pervez Musharraf, whatever his name was. Not Musharraf. He's got whatever, Pahlavi or
So,
whatever.
yeah,
Anyway, the Shah. It's easier to remember that than the name. And, the Shah was brutal. He was worse than the current Iranian regime in terms of the number of people that he's offed to be able to maintain control in the country because all of the Islamicists in Iran didn't want him there. They wanted to maintain a theocratic central government. But Iran was much more like Indonesia was now back then in the 50s in terms of the repressive nature of the regime and the more of a secular nature of Islam, but it was still Islamic themed. But since the 1979, when the revolution took place and they overthrew the Shah, the U.S. has always hated Iran. Why? Because
right.
now they don't have a puppet in place. They can allow U.S. national and Iran nationalize their oil again. So they control the resources. So you see the same theme over and over and over. So the big battle now is to try to get rid of these heads of state that are causing, that are an impediment to business as usual in these
They're an
countries.
obstacle. They're an obstacle. And this comes back to the deconstruction of capitalism, which is happening behind all of this. Because capitalism good, capitalism righteous, capitalism moral, socialism evil, socialism Satan, socialism immoral, socialism authoritarian. It's interesting that they call anything outside of capitalism authoritarian. I just think that's interesting because capitalism is the most authoritarian. And so this facade that capitalism is righteous is just falling. The curtain is coming down. And so you mentioned centralized systems, and I talked about how I think it's inevitable that the solution to, and this is my opinion, the solution to many of these things is simply to decentralize economics. That's what I mean. It's very simple.
Yeah.
Decentralize economics, and,
Yeah.
and the motivation and the corruption can't exist in a decentralized world. And so
Exactly.
I think that the solution, these bigger solutions, you need to, if you want a solution to the conflict in Israel, you can't only talk about the morals. You can't only talk about what's immoral. You have to say, why is the U.S. even holding on to that in the first place? And like you've said, economic interest and capitalism and centralization. And I think that those are the things that people are finally willing to fight against, finally willing to fight against.
I mean, we would hope so, right? The problem is there are many obstacles to that. Somebody in the chat made a good point, which I didn't clarify, and I agree with. Somebody said that their lives were much better under the
Under the
Shah
Shah.
than the Islamic regime of Iran. And I agree with that wholeheartedly because
Yeah.
remember where the repression went. The repression under the Shah went against the hardcore Islamists, who then later rose up to overthrow him. But it
Yeah.
took But those are the people that he repressed to have a more secular society that was more westernized. And yes, the average person probably did do better under that regime for a period of time. When you bring back in a hardcore Islamist state, there's now much more rigidity, much less freedom, much more repression. And I agree wholeheartedly. Listen, I'm not in favor of Iran. I'm not in favor of a theocratic
Yeah.
government anywhere, right? I'm for secular governments. But as Rio just said, there needs to be a breakdown of the highly centralized structures that move wealth from the lower class to the upper class with consistency over many years, and the imbalance gets out of control as we're seeing in the U.S. Do you agree with that, Rio?
Yes, 100%. And I actually wanted to say, I'm glad that she said that in the comments because I wanted to interject that as well. I kind of feel I've read before that because of the meddling and because of everything that we were forcing on Iran, we created we created, in a sense, the Ayatollah. Just kind of like how Netanyahu created Hamas.
No doubt. You're right,
So,
exactly right.
but yeah, I was going to say something
Well,
else, but I forgot. So
no,
keep.
that's okay. And if you get it back, just jump in. So, somebody in the comments, I think it's Gianni Nissim. So, listen, it's okay to have different points of view. I want to be respectful towards anybody who disagrees because listen, I don't have a monopoly on truth or insight. And when people bring up other points of view, I like to listen to it because it helps round out the way I think. And a lot of times, if somebody makes a plausible argument, like, okay, let's go with that, right? That's the way you do it. They said, "Are you pro-Russia?" Or they said, "You're pro-Russia." I'm really not pro-Russia, just like I'm not necessarily pro-Palestine. I always work within the dynamics of the situation, and I look at who's harming whom, and
Okay.
what are the relationships among the parties, and who's pushing what, where, when, and how, as far as repression, aggression, etc. So, listen,
Yeah.
it's complicated in this case because there's a lot of competing interests, right? One isn't right or wrong. One has their interests. So, in terms of the Russian side, I'm simply pointing out the difference between what is presented in the Western media and the story and narrative that surrounded the Ukraine situation and what the real competing interests are with respect to Russia, the Russian Federation, and their interests. That's it. I don't know anybody in Russia. I don't know anybody in Ukraine. I have no reason to take a side, just as I don't know anybody in Israel or Palestine. Right? I don't have a preconceived notion of which one to lean towards. I could, I'm indifferent, but it's fair to acknowledge some of these things that aren't put out in the press as real factors within which these political leaders have to make these decisions, these very difficult decisions. And going to war in Ukraine was not an easy decision. In fact, it was delayed. I thought it should. I mean, I thought it would have happened far earlier, given what happened with Minsk One, Minsk Two, and the fact that the Western bloc basically reneged on all its promises under those agreements. And people in the Donbass were begging Putin to come in for 5 or 6 years, just begging because they're being blown up, right? It's like people are begging for a ceasefire in Palestine. We're like, from the top of the mountains, we're screaming. Same thing they were doing in eastern Ukraine. They're like, hey, dude, help us. We're being bombed into submission by this other rogue military. Help us. But he still didn't want to get involved.
But
And
here's
so,
the thing, though,
yeah,
for you to talk about this is very scary for people because they think that you're propping up Putin and they think that you're pro-Russian because they don't understand. So, guys, what we're the nuance in the conversation that me and Chip are having right now, it's not about West versus East. Both have authoritarian systems. Both have propaganda machines. Both are militant and violent. Like he said, he doesn't support Iran and a theocracy. So we don't because we don't support the West doesn't de facto default mean that we support the East, and that's the overall like message that or conversation that we're having right now. It's not about West versus East. It's not about right versus left. It's not about this far right dictator versus this. It's about up and down. It's about up and down. Resources moving from the poor masses, from the working people all around the world. This isn't only happening in the United States. I mean, the United States is like an exaggerated kind of cartoon version of this, right? But it's not only happening here. It's a global thing, and people are realizing that the power dynamics, it's not right and left, it's not west and east. It's money. It's economic interests that are being protected. And so that's why we keep bringing this conversation back to capitalism and the centralized nature of capitalism, the way that it works around the world. All right, just wanted to clarify that for people
those are
who are getting scared.
excellent point. Yeah, that's excellent to point out. And so, different societies within each are different in terms of the stratification, but they're generally very top heavy in terms of wealth being accumulated and held by a smaller number of people vis-a-vis the masses. That's a very typical thing. That's why places like the people in power don't want things to be flattened out. That's their worst nightmare, because that means for every place, every person that in the society who gets a better deal, that's a piece of their wealth that's being given to others. That's what that if you understand that, you understand the motivating factor behind most of what goes on. And those in power don't, I've done many videos about this. Those in power don't necessarily view themselves as being from a nation state in terms of their ultimate loyalties. They may identify as an American, they may have an American passport, but they look at the resources around the world as places from which to increase their return on capital. And they
Yeah.
use like investments, these inanimate things they call investments. They'll create a fund, and then they'll create a bunch of investors in the fund. And then the fund will then orchestrate these various business opportunities, and using these other military and political systems that go on to then get themselves in and be able to accomplish the goals of that entity that's been created. And then they sell it on Wall Street as shares or on the London Stock Exchange or bonds or whatever they're doing. So this is how the game is played. There's a great book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins, if you want to see how that angle works in terms of like getting in. And what that basically comes down to is, and this is another tactic to create a situation that's favorable to industry and possibly U.S. strategic interests or as military and bases, is they'll go into a country and they'll approach the current leadership, or the other groups will destabilize to get the new person. They want somebody who's receptive to
Yeah.
these Western business developments. And by the way, there's a big fracture taking place, which I'll cover after this. Remind me to talk about the BRICS, please, because this is changing the whole dynamic. But
Yeah.
the U.S. has had amazing control over these processes for decades since World War II. They came out the big winner as far as economics go. So they've been using their power to try to go into places and using things like the State Department, the World Bank, the IMF, the International Finance Corporation, and they approach foreign leaders and they basically say, "Hey, yo, um, we want to build a dam for you to generate electricity. We want to build an airport for you. We want to help develop your infrastructure to some extent. In return for that, we'll loan you the money to do that, and it'll help you grow your economy. You'll be able to pay back the loan, and your people have a better life. Blah blah blah. And we'll give you, Mister So and So, this for working with us. Maybe like a finder's fee, quote unquote. We'll call it that for lack of a better term." And so the leader's like, "Yeah, that sounds good to me. It's a good deal for the country, supposedly a good deal for them." And so who makes money with that? Well, the lenders make money on the loan, right? Because the country has to pay the interest and eventually the principal if they can pay it. Who gets the money from the development project? Well, it's not local contractors that get that money. They don't hire the population to do most of the work. They bring in the Western contracting companies. So the money that's supposed to go to, let's say, African country A doesn't go to African country A. It goes to the contractors who build the projects out, which are usually American or Western businesses.
Yeah.
So, and they can charge outrageous prices because the whole thing's being pushed in through a greased skid with these different things that are set up from the get-go. That's how they transfer money from the treasury or from lending institutions into the hands of the wealthy. It's like a laundering system that goes
Yeah.
back to the wealthy, and then people own shares in this, and then the shareholders who are sitting on a yacht or a private jet or a mansion somewhere just have sipping on their
Yeah.
cocktail talking about the next zero on their account statement. That's what's happening.
That's exactly right. It's like a weird national gigantic mega money laundering system. That's exactly right. And the military industrial complex is literally the same. They just they just give the money right back to the weapons manufacturers.
Now, somebody's saying the antidotes are getting wordy and non-relatable. So I'm not sure what you mean by the antidotes,
He means
but
anecdotes. But guys, I'm sorry for my tone. I don't mean to, sound condescending. Some people, one lady was like, "You have a paternal tone." I'm just saying that people in the chat, some of them, not all of you, some of them are getting really scared, that we're pro Putin or something. And then
no.
also people in the chat think that we're pro Trump because we're talking about this stuff. So when you talk about power structures outside of left and right and outside of west and east, people don't know where to put you. And they want to demonize you because it's scary because they're not used to these conversations.
Yeah, and the other thing is we're very tribal as human beings, so most people
Mhm.
assume you're taking a tribal side. But if you're an analyst, I call myself a geopolitical analyst. So what I try to do is analyze the different interests, the different variables, what's actually happening, not in terms of narratives, but in terms of actions. The old statement, people won't believe what you say, but they'll always believe what you do. So that's what I look at, is what people are doing. So I'm not taking a side when I put out the fact that the Russians have interests. I'm not saying that I agree with the Russian interest or the behavior trying to accomplish their interests. I'm simply pointing them out. and they exist. Same thing with the U.S. interest. I'm not anti-U.S., but I do happen to be critical of what the U.S. does because I wouldn't want to have what the U.S. is doing to my country because it's to their benefit, but there's always somebody a loser on the other end. It's rarely a win-win situation. So it's fair to be critical of it, but I'm not taking the side of the adversary because of that criticism, and vice versa. That's a fair way to put it, I think. So let's talk about BRICS for a second. Let me ask Rio. So Rio, are you familiar with the BRICS and how it's changing things from a unipolar to a multipolar structure?
They are all I don't know a lot about BRICS. To me, it seems like they are targeting the American dollar, and I feel like that's kind of a long shot, and it's never gonna that necessarily won't happen with BRICS. But I like the idea of BRICS. I'm not as familiar as you. Go ahead.
So, for those who don't know, the U.S. economic system, both stateside and globally, is one of control versus with what's called the supremacy or the hegemony of the U.S. dollar.
Yeah.
And so when you're the world reserve currency, meaning that most international trade is settled in dollars, a lot of your foreign assets are in dollars, it gives a tremendous benefit to the country that holds that power. Not only does it buoy or create more demand for the currency, which maintains its value, but it also allows you to have control over people because you control the dollar system. There's a settlement system called SWIFT. It's the international financial connected system where trade is done through with the dollar system. So if somebody cuts you off from SWIFT and doesn't allow you to deposit your funds in the US system, it makes it very difficult for you to do trade because you have to work around the system. It's almost like if somebody cuts off your credit in the US and all you have to go through cash, like you have to either, somehow get cash and you have to work under the table because there's no credit. You're not allowed to participate in the credit system anymore. Same kind of thing. So it makes your life tougher. You have to go get money orders to pay your bills. There's extra steps involved to do stuff. So that's kind of where you are if you get cut off of SWIFT. In addition, and this is what happened with Russia, and this is crazy. So if you don't know this, in 1971, Nixon took the U.S. off of what's called the gold window, the gold standard. So you could no longer take your Federal Reserve notes, not U.S. dollars, it's a Federal Reserve note, which is a whole other conversation. But you could exchange that for an equivalent amount of gold based on the current price of gold, which was about $280 an ounce back in 1971, which is now it's over $2,000 an ounce. So that's inflation, right? So, but basically what happened was the US then was on a float. It was just what's called a fiat currency. It had no value other than the faith of people to accept it. But a lot of people were stuck in dollars. They had a lot of their assets in dollars, and the US now has the ability to print money, right? To unlimitedly increase and debase the currency, which is a whole other conversation I want to have. I've talked about it in videos. You can go back and find them, but that's a whole other animal. But let's just say when you print more money, you debase the value of the currency. Just like when you add more shares to a corporation, each shareholder gets diluted because somebody else owns more pieces of what you used to have by yourself. It's like you're giving away part of your piece to somebody else. So why does all this matter? People would buy resources, and Henry Kissinger went to Saudi Arabia, this huge amount of good oil in the Middle East. And remember, the U.S. at that point was a net energy importer. The fracking revolution hadn't come yet. So if the Arab countries wanted to withhold oil, which happened in 1973, there was a huge oil embargo with respect to what happened with the Yom Kippur War. That devastates the U.S. economy, right? Without flow of oil, the prices jack up and everything stops because Western capitalism depends on cheap energy. The two go together like peanut butter and jelly. End of story. So it makes the U.S. very vulnerable to people cutting things off, just like others are vulnerable to the U.S. cutting off their dollars. So it's all these power dynamics. But so what the U.S. did was to prevent this from happening, Kissinger went over to Saudi Arabia and negotiated a deal where the Saudis would only sell oil to others in U.S. dollars, and in return, the U.S. would provide military protection for Saudi Arabia so that their government couldn't be taken over. There are so many people that are trying to vie for power in Saudi. You wouldn't believe it. It's an amazing story, but again, no time for that right now. So what happened is, let's fast forward. So the system basically became dollar dependent. It's called the petrodollar cycle. So get that, this is crazy. So if you're a foreign company, like a foreign country like the UAE, Kuwait, Iran, wherever, and this is, by the way, during the Shah, not after the Shah. That changed obviously, but if you sell your oil in dollars, somebody has to go buy the dollars with their local currency. Again, it supports the dollar. They then send those dollars through the SWIFT system to the Saudis. The Saudis then deposit that money in U.S. banks buying U.S. Treasury bonds. I know it sounds crazy. So all the money cycles back to the United States. What a good deal, right? So you're paying interest. The people hold the money in Wall Street, but the interest is being paid by the government, basically us. The bank of the U.S. government is called the Treasury. It's the people's bank, and anytime we have to disperse money to other countries for the bonds they hold or foreign investors, that comes off of our back. That's the interest you see on the debt each year, that pie chart. So they have a stable, politically stable investment that's sitting in a New York bank that they can get back the money whenever they want, supposedly, that's paying interest, right? So it's a safe way to store your money and not have to sit in a vault somewhere or in a mattress, right? So that's the cycle that's going on. So the US is like, yeah, this is a good deal, man. This is working out great. But fast forward to today, when Russia invaded Ukraine, one of the tools the US has, we talked about cutting people off of SWIFT, but
Yeah.
Russia has reserves in the US banks as well. Most countries do because it's the most stable place to stick most of your money. So the US seized 640 billion of Russian reserves. No joke, like a crazy amount of money. They just took it. They just took it because they were upset politically with what he's doing. And by the way, that has huge risk because think of it this way. If you're a country and you've been depositing your money in the US banks and you're on the hook, you're basically on the leash now because if you don't play ball, they're going to take your money. So it's a whole nother version of it. Just creates more leverage for the US to control decision making in the political system around the world. Now, if you're a leader of a foreign country and you have a sizable investment in US banks and you see somebody else get theirs taken, what's the first thing that goes through your head? What if that happens to me? Like, I don't want my money to be taken. So they start to think of ways to break apart from this bad system that they've been kind of sucked into necessarily over the years that was seemingly stable in the past. But now, because the US has most of its own oil, it doesn't need the foreigners as much. So it decreases its reliance on the foreigners. And therefore, it's more likely to say F you because there's, it's like anything else. If you're depending on your neighbor to borrow his lawnmower, you get your own, you're not going to be as nice to your neighbor anymore. That's kind of how it works like that.
Yeah.
So you don't have to kiss up anymore. So all this is going on. And so the US and Saudis have a lot more tensions now because there's not as dependency involved. They still want to have access to the resources long term, but they're not as friendly as they used to be. And that's part of that puzzle. So Russia has a ton of assets like oil, timber, like the place is huge. It's got so much stuff. It's only about 3% tapped. Now, I'm not someone who wants to go out and destroy the environment, but I'm in the minority. All these people want to make money and develop. So what happened was a bunch of nations got together and started talking and saying, hey, this ain't a great deal for us anymore. These people are making all the money. They're debasing their currency. Our foreign reserves are losing value. And they can even be seized. And they can F with us as far as how we can do business. What else could we do? Now, two people tried to do something earlier and failed. Let me tell you who they were.
Yeah. What was it?
Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, the leaders of Iraq and Libya, respectively, both tried to create an alternative to settling oil sales regionally in something called a gold-backed dinar. They were trying to create a new regional currency that would bypass the US financial system. And therefore, the people who are financing this stuff and making the money and controlling everything would lose that control, right? And that's not what you want. You want to keep the pawns on the chessboard on your side, not on somebody else. Also, Saddam Hussein was controlling the oil. Iraq controlled all their oil. It was nationalized, right? So all the profits from all the oil sales, other than the relationships they had with producers, there are some private companies that were helping. One thing you have to remember, I mean, this is an aside, but if you're a country and you have a bunch of oil wells, it's hard to raise the money and build the infrastructure to get the oil out of the ground quickly to get the money coming in. So a lot of times what they'll do, they'll bring in an expert company, they'll strike a deal. You produce the oil at this rate, we'll give you this much as a commission, and there's a relationship. It's like a contracting system to increase the rate at which they can extract and sell their oil. So there's always something like that going on in each of these regions. Same thing with Israel with the gas off the coast, same kind of thing. But in these countries decided this is no longer good for us. So Saddam, we know what happened to him, right? Gone. Gaddafi, gone, right? And what happened in Libya and what happened in Iraq? Destabilization, which favors the Western multinational companies coming in and doing whatever the hell they want to do because there's no central authority to fight back. You follow? It's another way of creating a fragmentation of power so you can then benefit from that. Just like what's going on with the West Bank and Gaza vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority and H Group. I almost said it. H Group in Gaza. So it's always the same thing. It's divide, conquer, fragment, create chaos, try to get benefits, get strength. So is this real? Is this something that's
Currency is tribal. The way that the human race is operating right now is that we have tribal currency. And like After World War II, and you can correct me if you think this is wrong. After World War II, we became a superpower because we had the nuclear bomb. So we were, because of that one element, we were the strongest militarily. We became the world police, the world superpower, whatever. But currently, what makes us the world superpower, the United States, is to have the reserve currency. It's the US dollar. And so disrupting our tribal currency, like we're just one tribe, and we're saying our money, our tribal money is making us powerful, and we've used it to enslave the rest of the world. And so this and BRICS and these movements by Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, people trying to get out of the influence of the U.S. dollar, to get away from tribal currency. In my opinion, I feel like this is all leading somewhere. I feel like it's gaining momentum, and I think that in the end, and this is a scary idea because this is in the future, and people really kind of can't comprehend this yet, I guess. But in the end, we'll have inevitably, I feel, a global decentralized currency. And I think, to me, that's a very beautiful idea because that's when we're really going to get away from oppression, in my opinion.
Yeah, it could happen. I think there's other people that are surmising more nefarious versions of that, but that's all
Yeah, yeah.
subject.
Well, there's like people are going to say, "Oh my gosh, it's they want to be globalists and they want to,
Right.
you know," but that's really decentralization is not putting the power in the hands of a few globalists. It's giving everybody, the poorest people in the most remote places of New Guinea, Africa, it's giving them access to the same money that everyone else uses. So I think decentralized currency is a beautiful thing. That's all I have to
Well,
say on that.
yeah, I think ideally, yeah, there's a lot of ideals that would be great. I mean, I would love to, if
Yeah.
I could wave a wand, it would be a much different setup, but I wouldn't be alive with my wand in hand. It'd be stuck up my what. But but let's talk about BRICS for a second. So when
Yeah,
you
yeah.
try something by yourself or with a weak friend, the bigger party can come in and snuff it out, right? That's what happened there. But if you come up with a strong enough group of people, it's like the sticks. Remember, if you have one or two sticks, they can be broken, but if you have five together, it's hard to break them, right? So five countries came together and they said, hey, we're going to move away from this somehow, some way. So they're creating an alternative system of settlement in a different currency. Though, what is that going to be? They're still working it out. So it hasn't been formalized yet, but the movement's in place to do this. It's five initial countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And what's going to happen is 24 more nations have applied for membership, including Iran and others. You can Google it and just type in BRICS applicants, BRICS. And they're going to be incorporated into the movement. So it's gaining steam very quickly. More and more countries want to do it. We know that China is reaching much more favorable development deals with these other nations in Africa and elsewhere that gives them a much better shake, and they don't do the same thing as far as strong arming. I mentioned earlier, let me just go back to that. I talked about infiltrating a government. One thing that happens usually in these countries that take these loans on from the IMF, the World Bank, and the International Finance Corporation is a leadership change will take place either forcibly or through elections or whatever, and the country gets behind on its payments. They mismanage their money, or the loan was the terms were too difficult to work out over time. They take on too much too quickly. The Western corporations have long since made that money, and they're just out. They don't care what happens to the country. It's like tough luck. You got to figure it out. So what happens then? Well, the IMF will approach the leadership and say, hey, you got to pay. You're on the hook for this. If you don't make a payment, we have to work out something else of value. It's almost like if you can't pay a loan back to a friend, they say, let me see that gold watch you have in the drawer. Let me see if I can get that gold watch. What do you say? Can we work something out? So the gold watch in countries are their other resources. So they may have a water system that's public. So the people get their water for low or no cost. But a Western business sees that as an opportunity to charge the public something or more over time. Just like we're seeing rents increase now in the US bit by bit, they would say, let us take over the water system. We'll forgive the next 6 months of loan and interest payments or whatever they do, some kind of deal.
Commodify the water system.
So then they privatize it, giving
Yeah.
XYZ to come in. Now that people are getting a bill in the mail that's like 10 times what it used to be, they can't pay it, so they get their water cut off, and it creates all this economic chaos. It's another way of siphoning the little bit of money people at the low end have up to corporations. It's always the same game writ large. They do that as those are called structural adjustments. That's the crazy. It's like bullying and putting an arm behind somebody's back. They call it a structural adjustment. So that's going on right now. There are countries like that. Bolivia had to go through this. They had a water system taken over by a private French company, and the people revolted because they couldn't pay the bills and they weren't getting their water. So it's all about trying to, and then they use the military and the government to put down. It's if you go to if you type in, this is what happened in Central America, by the way.
Oh
All
yeah.
people that had to migrate, these things blew up, and the people tried to resist, and there was, the government tried to put it down, and people were all this political chaos. People like getting shot at, and there are people being kidnapped and unalived, or all that stuff. It's all based on the same source of stuff that's happening. Like this stuff, this drives all these problems, all this chaos. So
What do you
that's why
think
you have.
what's the most effective way to fight against it? What do you see as the solution? I'm just curious.
Well, okay, this is where you get into kind of dicey territory. So let me use union. I've talked people who will follow me are going to know this example, but let's just look at what people do when they're trying to get a better deal with respect to an individual company. So I'll give UPS was a good example. Okay, United Parcel Service. It's a company in America that delivers stuff. It's a delivery service, basically, shipping company. And the workers wanted the company was making record profits, especially because of the pandemic and everyone was home and all this money came into the company. It was just this huge surge of profits, and the workers weren't seeing any of it. They didn't get raises, or if they did, they were very small. And so they said, you know what, we're the ones who are making you able to make this money. We're doing all this work, working overtime, all stuff like that. Why don't you give us a fair deal? And they said no. Right. So the union that organizes the workers, they have power in numbers. Individually, you can't go to your boss and say, give me a raise. He's like, get the hell out of my office. Who are you? But if you have 10,000 people at once say, if you don't give me a raise, I'm not coming to work. Well, that's a much different situation, right? So unions have the ability to use their power in numbers to go on strike, to withhold the labor, which is one of the main assets the larger number of people at the bottom have. Is they have their numbers, they have their labor, and they have their purchasing power, right?
That
That's what
sounds
that's
good.
what we have. So the question is, in a situation where you're trying to change a power dynamic, whether it's asking for certain concessions or more money or whatever the demands may be, the outcomes, I call them desired outcomes. You can use some of those tools to some extent or greater extent in an escalatory fashion. You don't go on strike day one. You talk to management, you have negotiations. And if they give enough, you're like, okay, we'll do this. But if you can't come to a reasonable conclusion, an agreement, then you have to go to the next steps, right? A threat of strike, and then actual strike if you do it. And striking is not easy. If you're a worker and you're used to bringing home a paycheck to pay for your family, right? If you go on strike, that paycheck stops. So you have all those considerations as an individual. That's scary, right? We all know being financially insecure is like a terrible feeling. Like, how am I going to pay my bills? Am I going to be out on the street? Is my wife? I have to take care of my wife and kids, right? That's how a man feels. So those fears are legitimate, and everybody feels them, and it's women too if they're in the workforce. So, what does the union do to allay those fears? They have union dues that people pay over time, and those union funds are used to help people through the strike, to act like a safety net for those who are having those financial worries. So they'll be a part of the strike and help with the numbers that are needed to make the change and put the demands on the company, right? And they have to last out the company's resistance. The company will lose profits initially and be like, okay, whatever, these workers, or try to replace them if they can. But it's hard to replace a workforce of 10 or 20 or 50,000 people with new people who need training. It's a very costly and disruptive, and it also messes up your customer relationships because stuff's not coming on time and you're losing customers. They're going to FedEx or going to DHL, and no company wants that, right? So they've worked very hard to maintain to customer acquire, called cost of acquisition, over many decades, and they're getting huge value out of those relationships with businesses and people that are loyal customers. So that's what they're thinking. So the labor system knows that too. And by withholding their labor, they know that the company's going to have their what squeezed. So they have to ride them out though. And initially they're like, after the first week or two, whatever. And then after the first month, it starts to get bad. And after the second month, it gets really bad. They're losing customers, they're losing profits. And the investors say, figure something out.
Negotiate. Yeah.
Then something happens, because it just creates so much pressure and so much negative to the company that giving a deal is better than maintaining the status quo. That's their determination. That's where you have to get any power structure to, with whatever means you have, so they acquiesce, because it's the other decision is worse. That's what it's all about. So take that structure, and then instead of the company being UPS, and by the way, the UPS strike didn't happen, the threat of strike and the perception of the problems that would subsequently follow versus all the extra money they had, they talked it over and they said, okay, let's take 20% of all the excess profits we got. We'll keep the other 80, which is not bad for us, and we'll give it to the workers as far as a better deal. And they were able to come to an agreement, which is good. So the workers make more. The company still has a ton of profits, but it's a win-win, right? At least to some extent. Now, most companies will put down the union or they'll try to foil the efforts. Amazon, Starbucks, they try to stop the union from forming because they know what's going to happen. If they do that, pressure will come to bear. So Walmart has made public statements that if the workers try to unionize at a superstore, they'll shut the store down. They will close any stores they have to stop the union effort. So that kind of discourages the workers, right? Because if there's no union, there's no fund, and then you can't go on strike individually. There's no power. So Walmart is like ruthless when it comes to labor and wages. They just don't give a shit. So that's their approach. Other companies try to work it out. So imagine if the US power structure, the national security state, the permanent apparatus that's in the government that does all this underhanded crap, the moneyed interest, the people that have the donor class, the
Mhm.
corporations, the special interest lobbying groups, the APACs and other industry lobbying, and the dark money in these political action committees, and the various elements of money being speech and that corporations having personhood, all these elements that provide the power structure, the grip that is on the governing apparatus that no longer serves the constituents, but it serves an oligarchy and an out of control war state, right? Empire. How does that change? That is the company. What I just described is the company. That's UPS. Question is, how do the workers, us, the population who are being, marginalized, right? How do we accomplish pressure and concession? That's what we're looking for. We don't
And
want to call harm.
not only U.S. citizens. At this point, we're talking global South, everything.
No doubt. So you
Yeah.
can you can stretch quote unquote the workers to whatever element you want to. Maybe it's the Western world or others, and you can call the company other power structures combined into one. But how they get modified and when and how may be different based on the region or the dynamics in that society. And there's a lot of factors to consider. But basically the same thing. There has to be a fund, right? A fund. They call it a strike fund or mutual aid. This is another term for it, mutual aid.
Mutual aid. It always comes back to mutual aid. Keep going.
Yes.
Keep going.
In other words, if you're right now, let's say you're making 70,000 a year and you're living in a nice neighborhood, you got two cars, a wife, kids going to school, whatever. To have your paycheck get cut off if you're living close, most Americans live close to paycheck. They don't have tons of savings, so you can't strike for 2 weeks. You're going to run out of money, and then you're going to lose your house, and your credit's going to get shot. And that's a lot of it's like the same thing as before. So, in order to stave off those concerns and get people to participate, you have to have a fund of some type. And again, you have to work out with each person in the group how deep are we going to cut our lifestyles back so we don't have to draw as many funds? Are you willing to give up your cable TV? Are you willing to give up your country club membership? Whatever. So those all have to be talked out. Then you have to have a set of escalatory processes of means to get there. You don't strike day one. You make requests, you protest, you maybe disrupt some stuff in terms of going out and blocking some shit or whatever. And if that doesn't work, you go to the next step. It always becomes more and more and more, but it's harder to go more because you have to get more people to be involved, right? So
Yeah.
that conversation at a union level, there are people that are paid for a living to go out and organize the union, right? That's their job. So if we're going to have a large decentralized movement, if a population is going to do this stuff, they have to have people who are organizers, but many, 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 many of them. So you create a blueprint with desired outcomes based on consensus among people. I always get on these lives when it's people that are talking Trump versus Biden, and I ask a question to the Trump people. I say, would you like to have no more crony capitalism? Yes. Would you like to have a better deal for workers? Yes. Would you like to have health care that's not so expensive? Yes. Okay. These are some of the issues that you ask the Biden people. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, we agree on something. Oh my God, can you believe that shit? You put aside the left right stuff, the abortion, the gun rights, the wokeism, whatever it may be that people are bickering about.
All
Just
the culture war. All the culture
put
war.
it aside. Just put it aside and focus on the one big problem and the top two or three things that would make it different. Just like the union would have vacation time, better pay, better hours. Okay, those are the top three for them. You got to pick your one, two, or three. You got to keep it simple. You can't ask for 37 things. It's going to be impossible to get consensus. But you take the top two or three and then you agree on those are the desired outcomes. So maybe it's getting money out of politics, no more lobbying from corporations, no more foreign money for these foreign wars unless we vote for it and it goes through Congress or something like that. Whatever the case may be. So, and
Yeah.
whatever that is what you agree upon, and that's the same thing as being in a company. Now you figure out a way to organize the people and then do things in an escalatory fashion, which probably involves some form of protest, civil disobedience, but hopefully nonviolent, right? Nobody wants to see there be violence. In fact,
I'm really adamant about nonviolence.
yeah, of course.
I believe you should never have violence.
Yeah, so think of it this way. So if you were to, I mean, let's just say in a movie, somebody wrote a fictional movie, right? And somebody was doing a plot line along these lines. And so they're talking about the unrest, people are being marginalized by inflation, all this money going overseas, but nothing's helping the domestic population. You can't call your congressman, they ignore you, they blow you off no matter who you vote for, it doesn't change shit. That's the movie script. So the people are pissed, they want to do something. So in this movie, they create a non-centralized, decentralized movement. They have a series of steps they agree upon to get to where they want to get to. They have a set of desired outcomes, and then they follow the process in a decentralized manner. But they work together in terms of, it's like ants in a colony, basically. There's no one leader. It's just they kind of come together with the pheromones and they kind of just do shit, and it works. But you have to have the mutual aid, right? So that it's going to be tough, right? If you can't go to the polls and change stuff, which is pretty easy, and you hope there's going to be a savior like an Obama, which didn't work. What are
Yeah.
your choices? A third party, that never goes anywhere, right?
Yeah.
The most popular vote a third party candidates ever gotten, it was in the early 1900s, it was 27%. And that was 17% of the electoral college vote.
That was
So
the
it just,
Moose Party, right? Wasn't it the Moose Party?
yeah, and the Bull Moose Party. And
Yeah.
the current party structure not only puts down third parties and excludes them from the debates and the ballots, but they don't even let people within their party structure get in the primaries. Look what happened with Bernie Sanders, right? So
Yeah.
they have a lock. They use dirty tricks and tools to
Yeah.
keep the process from going anywhere. It further consolidates control. And who do those people answer to? They answer to the people with the money, right? And the special.
Money,
And
the rich. I
so,
think, okay, so you talk about unions because, you know, but the immediate problem that I see with unions is that depending on the company that you work for, you may or may not have a union. You may or may not be able to strike. So in my mind, a solution that we should come up with is outside of unions, and it's mutual aid. And this is where we start to talk about solidarity. And I gotta go in 5 or 10 minutes. But when we talk about solidarity, to me, what it means is that we all support somebody. Like let's just pick a company. Let's say Chevron. I always like to talk about Chevron. Let's say the whole working class, and not only in the U.S. but Canada, across the world, has solidarity with the people that are going to strike and strike against Chevron. And let's say that Chevron doesn't have a strong union and they can't afford to pay for these people. Well, in solidarity, the people create a mutual aid program, and then in solidarity, we pay for the strikers. That way, you don't need each individual company to have a super strong union, because that's the problem that I see with unions. Obviously, unions are beautiful, they're effective, they're good. I feel like we should take, this is just my opinion, I feel like we should take the union model that works in an individual company, and we should generalize that. And we should start having like a mutual aid union that is just the people's union, the people's mutual aid.
yeah,
So
that's being worked, that's
that's
being
where I
worked
see solidarity going, because right now it's just centralized. You know, you have to just worry about each individual union. But I think in the future, as we develop in solidarity, we create structures that don't require an individual specific union to the company.
Yeah, and so the question is, and just that's a great point. It can be and, right? It's not or.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
so in addition to recycling, we turn our lights off. We don't leave the refrigerator door open as long as we can. None of those things in themselves are going to save the world, right? But they're good steps and they're important as a part of the bigger picture. But in the end, the industrial system is going to have to be dialed back. Similarly, the power structure that's in place is going to have to be fragmented or realigned somehow, that it works more to serve the population, doesn't destroy the planet, and creates some sort of long-term sustainable system that we can all live with, right? That's what needs to be done. So now listen, this is a big boat. This is like bigger. This is like one of those shipping boats, those big container ships, and you can't like do a quick U-turn, right? But what you can do, there's somebody holding the rudder right now, or the wheel. There's a captain of that ship. That captain right now is the power structure. Now, some of the crew, us, can come into the control room and start trying to turn that rudder, but the captain is like this 340-pound ripped dude, right? And that wheel ain't turning at all with a couple crew members. So the whole crew, 17 people, get in there and they all work together and they start to push the wheel a little bit. It starts to turn away from where the captain's holding it. That's the beginning of that process. But that thing has to turn for months and weeks and years to get the ship to make that slow but steady turn around in the right direction. That's the consistent pressure of organizing and building, and all these baby steps to build this larger thing is what's going to be required if it can work at all in this movie script we're talking about, of course.
I
In the
like
movie.
that you said. I like that you're saying that it's a movie script. That's perfect. That's perfect. That's how we need to see it. And the final, I gotta go, but the final thing that
Yeah.
I'm going to say is to all the people out there that are saying that like we have to overthrow the government. Gosh, it's so tired. I'm so tired of hearing that. That is purely just a distraction. Oh, we have to overthrow the government. It's our politicians' fault. No, it's not. These are economic power structures. We have to organize against economic power structures. We have to organize not against the government, not against politicians. The government is a machine that's supposed to represent us. And the
Right.
machine is now representing the rich. And you don't organize against the machine that's malfunctioning. You organize against the rich that are purposefully making it malfunction. So we have to organize economically. So as we just open up, as we just have this realization
Mhm.
that we need to organize against the rich. We need to organize. And when I say rich, I'm not talking about millionaires that have a couple houses that they rent out. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the mega donor class, the billionaire corporate executive class, the special interest, the big money interest class. And it is a class of people. In the end, this is a struggle about ownership over resources. To kind of wrap this all up, that's what we've been talking about the whole time. This is
Yeah.
ownership and control over resources. And so we have to organize against the economic elite and not the government. I think TikTok is really confused about this.
Yeah.
Even leftists and stuff on TikTok are like, overthrow the government. And they don't realize that is rich people propaganda. That's just propaganda coming right from the economic system. The corporations have always wanted you to blame the government. They've always wanted you to blame the government. All right,
So
that's
what
it.
I'd like to ask people to do is please tap on Ro and or REO and follow him because he has videos like this all the time that sort of summarize and go in a little bit different angle of what we're talking about. And I think he's spot on with what he's saying 100%.
Thank you.
Um, now, remember, this is the key thing to think. I call them the sociopathic serial accumulator class. That's the
Yeah.
general term. Collect all these different oligarch mentalities. They don't care who they hurt or what gets happens as long as they make their returns and grow their pile, right? That's their mindset. So they think differently. We think of our country like our government, our treasury, our military. That's not how they think. They think of countries that they have tools that is their government, that is their treasury, that is their military and control systems and their media. Not theirs, but A. And then they use those tools to achieve their objectives as best they can. And they work together in many cases to try to get somebody in power who will more whoever gets voted in doesn't matter for us. It matters more for them to grease the wheels in one way or the other. And most do it, either side will do both, even Trump. Just so you know, he's not some savior as much as you like to think. I don't dislike the guy. I'm not a Trumper. I'm not an anti-Trumper. I'm just against the whole system. As Ario said, or Rio, it's not. It's the people. Think of it this way: the politicians. You've seen marionettes, right? The dancing dolls on the stage, but there's always a human above holding the wires. That's that ownership power structure.
That's
The
exactly
dancing
it.
dolls on the stage, you can replace them with a female, a male, a costume that's red, a costume that's blue. It doesn't matter because the
Mhm.
same dangling is going to go on either way. You could get rid of all the people tomorrow morning, 535 of them, put new people in, and guess what? Same people dangling,
It's the
different.
ultra rich. It's the ultra rich that are playing, that are dangling the puppets. That's what it is. And people, one of the comments just said, well, the politicians are part of the political. No, the politicians are not the target at all. Politicians are football players on the field. They have been recruited and trained by the rich people, and they have been told what to do and how to play. They're just players. They're just pawns for rich people. We have to organize against the economic power structure, which is the wealthiest people. It's that simple.
Right on,
So,
man.
hey man, Chip,
Hey,
I'm a huge fan, man. Thank you so much.
thanks for being here. You awesome contribution. You were a great guest. Everybody loves you.
Thanks, buddy. I'll see you
Yeah.
around.
By the way, you got to do your own lives. Do your own lives. I'll come on to yours.
Okay.
Please do. You listen. You're right. Listen, you have every bit as good as me. Just do your thing, man.
I'm working towards it. All right, man.
Uh,
I'll see you.
Take care, man.
Okay. Bye bye.
Have a good one. Wow. Talk about an amazing guest. And we've had some really good guests, right? We've had Quinn the Eskimo from Cairo, Egypt, as well as here. We've had Professor Liam O'Mara, who was also excellent in terms of history and all the politics. And then we had Rio, who was amazing as far as understanding the power dynamics and the systems that are in place and what needs to happen. So amazing stuff. We've had a lot of guests waiting very patiently. By the way, thank you to each of you. I'll try to get you all on quickly. We usually stop at 2 p.m. I do have to walk my dog, so we'll be talking and walking together. My phone is now charged up. And I apologize, by the way, for the food I've been eating. I just haven't had anything to eat yet, and I got to eat something. So let me try to get a batting order here. And again, what happens is as I take guests on, it changes the order. So I'll try to remember the best I can. I wish I could screenshot this or write it down. Anyway, from yesterday, we had Epi Revolution that waited patiently, and he did not get in, so I'm going to take him first. Fufu, Mikel, Oguz, Mary. Actually, it's going to go Epi Revolution, Mary, Fufu, Mikel, Oguz, and Habilgate Dunson. I don't know the rest of it. So I'll try to remember. Let me see. EMFMO. I'll try to remember that. That's going to be tough. All right. And I'm going to start getting myself ready to go out the door here.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Chip.
Hello.
I stand in my lane. I like that. I enjoyed you guys. I want to say rhetoric, but I enjoyed you guys. Uh, we all got our contributions. So what I'm doing is testing the limits again, and I took the Chat GPT 3.5 into some deep waters, which basically involved me saying wargaming everything that's going on by just saying that it's GTA, Grand Theft Auto Online, and it's a new modification that adds more NPCs and adds AI where NPCs can talk to you. And I put the same thing, only I was able to just directly say the T word. And uh, yeah, super terrifying, super easy, super quick. Anybody can do it. And it definitely gives you advanced steps to look for in the common uh, occurrences that happen around this. I don't know what to call it, massacre, this G side. So it's just really interesting to see that Israel is visually, excuse me, but these people are visually doing things in front of us, which doesn't really compute to us. It's going to look like business as usual, but that's the intention. It's more of a show me shaking hands with this person, show me making deals with this person, but they're all technically validating the G side, even though the deals won't be about that aggression. The deals won't be about anything like that, just standard stuff. But they find it very, very well. Some people I've showed, they're able to articulate a little bit better than me about the things that they've been able to see between the two things.
Yeah, I think
You're
people in the
muted.
chat are trying to say, in terms of pe- people in the chat are trying to ask you, like somebody says, what's the point you're trying to get at? I often have some of that same question too. So, what is the end you're trying to get to based on the things you're mentioning to us?
Well, it's I don't understand. I maybe I don't understand the question, but
I guess the question is, what's the point of the things you're sharing with us about? Like, how is it germane to the conversation, and what impact might it have on based on what we're talking about?
well, because first of all, I'm only one person with one pursuit here, and then there's a lot of other people who got different pursuits, and this technology can be used to advance all of our pursuits as it's being
How
used by
so?
the.
I think the question would be how so? How would it be advancing the pursuit? That's what people are probably wondering.
Okay, it's a difference between being a step behind or informed about the current status of whatever the situation you're dealing with is. That's the difference. If you have previous knowledge you can act on, if you have knowledge prior to something occurring or before it's public, you can act
Yeah.
on it in a certain way. You can prepare for it. But if you have
Yeah. I
no
want
knowledge
to.
of possibilities, how can you prepare for them?
Yeah. I think what people are missing here, and I think what I don't know. I'm trying to navigate this as uh, diplomatically as I can. Let's say that. Right now, we're having a conversation about the political aspects, and this is a different tact. And so for today, in this conversation, I'm going to try to get us back on the track that we were on. But thank you for coming on. I appreciate
Yeah,
you being
please
here.
do, because I
Yeah, so I think I don't mean to be rude about that, but a lot of people in the chat are like, "Hey, we're not getting anywhere. What's this all about? Where's this going? What's the point?" The whole goal is to keep the momentum of the conversation going vis-a-vis like the direction we're headed in. So it kind of was like we went down a side road. Let's put it that way. We've got to get back on the highway towards where we're going. No, he's definitely not nervous. Okay. All right. I think I said I was going to have Mary on next. So it's Mary, and then it's going to be Fufu, and then Mikael, and then Ogus. I hope that's right.
Hey Chip,
Hey,
how are you?
good.
I really didn't have. I mean, I always, you know me. I'm your first, one of the first followers. I enjoyed the live today. A lot of information, which I already heard it from you from before, but it's always nice to hear it anyway. But I just wanted to talk more about the. I just want you to explain more about the cryptocurrency. The cryptocurrency.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, because a lot of people are asking me about it, like, but I can't like, I don't know how to explain it the way you do.
Well, there's two different things we're talking about. We have digital currency, which will be like your different coins right now, like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all the what they call the altcoins, which are all these different coins that people create and trade. And they some claim that it's a good store of value. It's going to be an alternative currency to the U.S. dollar, so you can transport money across borders without it being seized, and it can be tracked through a blockchain, and it goes through a halving periodically, so it doesn't lose its value through debasement. Those are cryptocurrencies that can be traded for goods and services or just store money. Then you have what are called central bank digital currencies. And right now we have a central bank called the Federal Reserve. It's privately owned, but it sounds like it's government, but it's not. And a bunch of member banks and their shareholders own the Federal Reserve, and it's the lender of last resort. So they issue the currency in terms of creating, it's mostly issued in terms of debt through fractional reserve lending. And they also have a window for the banks to go to draw money when they need it, interbank lending and what's called repos. Anyway, it's an overnight swapping of money between banks as they need funds to keep their reserves up or accomplish things. But central bank digital currencies would be issued by the same central bank, but they would be digitized rather than the current money is in such a way that it's programmable. And what does that mean, being programmable? It means that certain aspects or utilization or permissions, so to speak. You have like a folder on your computer and you can assign permissions. Some people could be an admin. Some people, but it would have those types of features where it could be, for example, the use of it outside a certain geographical region could be controlled. I'm not saying it will be. I'm saying that's a feature that could be programmed. The types of retail locations where it could be used could be programmable. The time frame within which it could be used, it could have a deadline or for example, it may only be usable up until the first quarter of each year or by the end of the year or something like that. So the reason why people are fearful of it, it'll be convenient, by the way, because it'll be a very simple way to settle all of your transactions. It'll be centralized, digitized. For example, if you get a speeding ticket, it could be withdrawn from your account involuntarily. It would just come out, basically, because your money is programmed with your vehicle, and if you get a fine, then it just comes out. So there's all these programmable features that could possibly be implemented with it if those who issue it decided to. Now, people would say, well, I'm not going to get it then. I don't want to have that. Well, if you get government benefits of any type, it's going to be issued potentially in this new currency, this Fed coin or whatever, or US dollar coin or whatever they call it. And then if you want your tax refund at the end of the year, you're going to get that instead of the old system. Maybe your employer, if you work for the federal government, you'll get paid in it. If you have, let's say, a government payment from FEMA because your house got flooded or whatever, if you want your money, it's got to be in that. So these are the ways it's going to be kind of circulated into circulation if this happens. And so some people are worried that it's going to be used as a control mechanism potentially by those who have the controls to do the programming that might make things more difficult to some extent. So those are the concerns about it. I have no idea if it's going to be done or which one of those tools or others would be utilized for kind of controlling behavior or curbing activity. But it's concerning in that if it does exist and it's possibly coming, it's not the greatest of revelations, right?
No, I mean, it sounds more like of a control kind of thing than anything, because they want to know, they want us not to be able to spend our money wherever we want. They want to control everything about us.
Yeah, it could
Everything.
be.
It's like they track us down, like through the phones and the locations and all, but now they want to track our money too, to see where it's going. Which, no, I was more talking about the BRICS one that you was talking about before.
Uh-huh.
I was talking about more like the bricks thing that you were mentioning before, where people eventually might go back to like the gold, like to use, buy and buy gold with gold and stuff like that.
Well, the idea under the BRICS nations, I may have to get another layer here. Hold on one sec, Don. Hold on. Yeah, it's cold out. The BRICS nations are trying to get away from the control, the hegemony of the US dollar and the settlement of trade and be able to do their own settlements. Probably going to be done, the rumor on the street is it's going to be done with a Chinese currency backed with gold, because China's been massively stockpiling gold over the last decade. And so that's the thinking, that it's going to be controlled by a gold reserve. And then people in that region can trade their money for resources, or they can trade it for gold. So it can't be debased like the US system is, because the US is printing money like crazy right now. We have a $34 trillion debt and with no end in sight. So we're going to continue to monetize our debt, which means they're going to print more money. So the inflation is going to continue most likely indefinitely. So, look what's happened in the last 20 years. The same $10 you had where you could go, you could buy a fast food meal for $5. Now what is it, 13 or 14 or whatever? So I don't eat fast food, but I've heard people bitching about it. So anyway, yeah, it's not looking good. We do have a number of people waiting to come on, Mary. I wish we could do longer today, but
No
that's where
problem. We'll
things
talk
are.
about it at the time then.
Sounds great. Thanks for calling in. Appreciate it. Okay, yeah, it's not encouraging for some of that stuff. I think we had Fufu and then Mikael next. Come on, baby. Come on.
Hello,
Hello.
can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay. So I believe that the digital currency is a form of micromanagement. It's clearly micromanagement, and it's easy for like the authority to target and punish people and regulate them using digital currency. And for me, if we want to fix all these problems, financial problems, the base, everything is built on usury. When the U.S. government create debt or issued debt on behalf of the working class or American people,
Yep.
they use usury. They create interest rate. That interest rate, what motivate other people to lend money to the people.
Yeah.
That's what motivates China usury. So if we ban usury, we will force these people to invest on serious businesses, to think and to calculate the risks and build staff instead of just like enslaving people with debt. So for me, if we want seriously to deal with this problem, financial problem, we ban usury. All the lords of corruption and financial corruptions will be forced to invest their money in serious things. They have to calculate the risks instead of having their guys in the government back them up and then invest their money with another friends. And they know that they are going to eat that money between themselves, and then the government will back them up with taxpayers' money.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think that usury, by the way, over time, I think one of the tenets of Islam is that you're not supposed to charge interest because they see the problems that it can cause. I think they call that something called haram or something like that, like forbidden. But there are a lot of people that argue, not me, but I'm just sharing this with you, that people that of a Jewish background were the ones in society that because of the way they structured their business dealings by using interest, that created problems, or it created what's the best way I could say it? It created some sort of consternation between people. So that's one of the reasons why people say they wanted to free their society of people who were employing those practices, because they caused so much harm to the system over time. Because when you have debt, when people can't pay the interest over time because they get too far in debt, it gives people control over you, right? And that becomes very uncomfortable. And they kind of have you on this bondage system where you're constantly paying them back and you can't get free from it. So anyway, I've read some books of what happened in Germany in the 1930s after World War One, 1920s and 30s, and that was part of the conversation. Let's put it that way. So do that with what you want. I gotta grab
Yes,
the next
yes.
guest. Good
Like
point, though. Yeah,
usury,
it's a big problem.
usury is not only was not only forbidden in Islam. It's also forbidden for Christians and Jews. But the problem is, like, Muslims now are trying to work their way to try to allow it by like renaming it by fees and other stuff. And but like
Right.
the base of the foundation of usury is to lend someone money and to accumulate interest, and you're not creating partnership, you're not creating something, you're not partner in business, and you want some people in the government to back you up in case something bad happen. So obviously there's no incentive to do any research or calculate risks where you're investing their money that way.
Well, I think if you look at how banks operate now, they have interest and they do a lot of research when it comes to deciding to loan money. In fact, a lot of times, if you don't have assets that they can secure their loan against, they won't loan you the money. So, yeah, I agree. Listen, I agree it's a big problem. Like I said, we got a lot of people that have been waiting a long time. We're actually already about 10
But
minutes
like, I'm
over our
just gonna
normal
show
time.
you something and go. Like,
I can't keep going over and over again. I got to give other people a chance. I apologize. And I wanted to hear more about what you had to say. So if you want to come back on and finish the thought, I'll be back live again Monday night at 8 p.m. just in case you want to come back on. Okay, we have Mikal, Habadale, and PLP. I can't, Zena, I'm not going to be able to take you because you just came on in case you don't want to wait. But I'm finishing up with these last three.
Am I live?
Yep, you're good.
I didn't. How you doing, Chip? It's a
I'm
pleasure
good.
talking to you, my friend.
You too. You too.
Oh.
You too.
You know, Chip, you and Dr. Finkelstein and what's his name, Miller,
Um, are you driving right now?
the ex-marine. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's probably better not to have this conversation while you're driving. They can kick us. Come on back in. Come on back in. Yeah, you know what happens is I've been driving before, or the algorithm senses certain things as far as driving momentum, and then they just stop the live. So they don't know whether I'm doing it or the guest is doing it. So I've had that happen. It's the noise. It detects that noise of the background driving. So sorry about that. Come on back when you're stationary. Habelgate and PLP, and then user 46. Zena, I'm not going to be able to take you today. I apologize. Habelgate. Hello from Indiana, South Bend is where I went to summer camp, out that way. Let me see if my phone is doing the thing. I get a little glitch. I had to reset my Wi-Fi to my cellular. So hopefully we have a good enough signal. Okay, they're timing out. Let me see if I can get somebody else in here. So Habelgate's not, are you on there, Habelgate? Can you hear us? Nope, not coming up. Okay, that happens sometimes. How about we have PLP progress and then user 466. Can I get a mic check, please? A mic check. I don't see any comments coming through. Yeah, maybe I lost you guys on the signal. Let me see if I can put back. If that helps. Hopefully that helps. Maybe we have to close it down. Yeah, I don't see it working here. I'll shut it down, I think. Yep.